Roger Federer is by far and wide the greatest tennis player that ever lived. He is the biggest star in the history of the sport. And if you've been watching tennis at all in the past 20 years, you must appreciate this man's greatness. If you're not a Federer fan, I have a hard time believing that you're a real tennis fan, because somewhere in the last 20 years you must have been a Federer fan. If not, then you rooted against him. But that would mean that you must have been a bandwagon fan and you hopped on the Nadal bandwagon, or the Andy Murray bandwagon, or the Djokovic bandwagon. And this is no different than jumping on the LeBron James bandwagon, or something of that nature, even though he doesn't play for your team. But in tennis, more than any other sport, the players are put on a pedestal and they're showered with praise and adulation, or perhaps the opposite. But let's just talk about his accomplishments, okay? I'll put some graphics up on the screen. First, you have his Grand Slam title, which is incredibly impressive. Whether or not someone actually manages to catch his Grand Slam total, assuming that he doesn't add on to it, it doesn't make a difference, because at his peak, he was the most dominant player that we had ever seen. Surely the greatest offensive player in the game, and one of the greatest defensive players. His service returning, particularly his first service returns, are crucially underrated, criminally underrated as an aspect of his game. But of course, he is the most well-rounded player of all time. And it's more than his sheer dominance that makes him the greatest. It's the elegance, the Swiss precision, the efficiency, the tactility, and his gracefulness, and his effortlessness. It's all of those things combined that makes him a player that we've never seen before. At his peak, consider the 2004 U.S. Open final, where he defeated his longtime rival with 2 bagels in the final. Beat him in straight sets with 2 bagels. Never before had a former world number 1 player like Lleyton Hewitt been totally dismantled in a match like that. Fully healthy going into the match. It was considered to be a marquee matchup, and Federer just destroyed him, played a brand of tennis that had never been seen before, and everyone was calling this guy the GOAT. And the thing is, people refer so much to a weak era, but I don't know how an era could be weak in which you played against Pete Sampras, you played against Andre Agassi 11 times, you played against all of the players coming out of the 1990s. Federer himself made his debut in 1998. You played all those guys, you beat almost all of them, whether they were in their absolute prime or not. You still kicked Sampras out of Wimbledon. You beat Andre Agassi 8 of the 11 times. And as for his contemporaries, the Nalbandians, the Safins, the Hewitts, the Roddick's, all of those guys, they had all won Grand Slams except for Nalbandian. But Lleyton Hewitt was a 2-time Grand Slam champion, a former world number 1. Safin, same thing, 2 times Grand Slam champion, former world number 1. Roddick won a Grand Slam and earned the number 1 spot. And none of these guys would ever achieve anything Grand Slams, world number 1. Roger took that from all of them, and he just flipped the switch and started to dominate all of his rivalries for years. And then that's when the Nadals came in, and the Djokovic's and the Murrays. And people can talk about the head-to-head, but it was only when Roger Federer turned, I believe it was 35, when Djokovic, who's 6 years younger, all of the big four are younger than Roger by 5 or 6 years. And it took about 40 matches between them for Djokovic to lead that head-to-head. Okay, so head-to-head isn't everything. But what's important is that Roger Federer, he has won 20 Grand Slams, 27 Masters. He's the oldest world number one in history. He's been the year-end number one, I believe, 4 times. And he's won the record 6 ATP World Finals. At his peak, he was number one in the world for 5 years consecutively, 237 consecutive weeks. That in and of itself, is almost a record for the total time spent at world number one. But he also has that at 310 weeks. And just think about in 6 years, he won 15 Grand Slams, all inside of a decade. 5 consecutive title defenses at the U.S. Open, unprecedented, while also going to 7 consecutive Wimbledon finals, winning 6 of 7, losing in nothing less than the greatest match ever played, winning 5 in a row. He won the Australian Open 3 times in 5 years, and that brings me to the other stats. 10 consecutive finals from 2005 to 2007. 36 consecutive quarterfinals. No one will ever break that. 23 consecutive semifinals. No one's ever going to touch that either. People talk about Djokovic being the best hardcourt player of all time. Well, Roger has 11 hardcourt Grand Slam titles. He's got 56. The best win streak of all time on that surface was 56. Belongs to Federer. Grass, 65 wins in a row on grass. Belongs to Federer. He was the one, after all, that broke Nadal's 81 match win streak on clay. And I believe the other time he had like a 30 to 40 win streak on clay. It was Federer that was beating him at the Masters. It was Federer making it to the finals every year. Federer could have had 3 or 4 calendar slams if not for Nadal. So people talk about these meaningless statistics. And think of the era that is going on right now. Okay, Andy Murray, unfortunately, has suffered a career-ending injury, and he's done. So that's a member of the Big Four out of the way right there. Wawrinka's getting old. He's pushing 35, and he's dealt with his ailments. Those are the 2 players outside of those 3, Nadal, Djokovic, and Federer, that were winning the most Grand Slams. Almost no one else was winning. Those guys are out of the picture. Both of those guys on their best day could beat Djokovic, even in Grand Slam finals. Federer is pushing 38. He's going to retire soon. He has nothing left to prove. And so you're left with these young players that are untested and unproven. And at this moment, Zverev continues to collapse in the best of 5 sets. He doesn't have the conditioning. He might even be overrated as far as I'm concerned. He certainly doesn't have the determination or the mental fortitude to go far. I could say the same for Nick Kyrgios, although I like Nick Kyrgios. I'd love to see him go on and win a few Grand Slams. Both of these guys are extremely talented, but they're not Djokovic and Nadal and Federer. So at this moment, no one can really challenge those guys. And that's why this is the weak era. It isn't the 2000s decade. It's this era right now. Because all those guys are old and they're still winning. And of course they are great. But when you have no one to challenge your dominance, it isn't that you're just too good. No one's there to challenge it. And I don't ever want to hear about Djokovic in the same breath as Federer. He's just Federer's just completely different. It's like Beauty and the Beast. That's the way people always looked at Nadal and Federer. Nadal, to me, is clearly the second best of all time. You know, he's the only top player that has had all of these injuries. Don't forget about Del Potro, but he's had, we can make the argument that Nadal's the greatest of all time, but he doesn't possess all of the weapons that Federer has. He doesn't have Federer's elegance and his natural talent, but he's definitely the greatest athlete, I think, that ever played tennis and the greatest competitor. Maybe not so much recently, but at his peak, he was the only person competing with Roger, and that counts for something. But anyway, you can look at all the graphics, you can look at all the statistics, you can, in almost all the categories, Federer ranks up there. He's second all time on titles won. He could potentially pass 100 titles. It doesn't really make a difference if he does. He is the third most all-time on aces. Probably the best. He probably has the best serve in the history of the game. Some would say Sampras, but think about how much slower the courts are now. The hard courts are slower than they used to be. The grass courts are a lot slower. Clay courts are actually getting a lot faster. The rules are completely different. But Rogers dominated in 2 different decades, which no one else can say that they've done in the whole history of the sport. And there's just, it doesn't matter if someone comes along and surpasses these records, because it's not just what he's done, but how he's done it. So he is the greatest of all time. He is one of the greatest sportsmen of all time, and definitely the best of the 21st century. Maybe not the best to make his debut in the 21st century, but he has crafted a legacy and elevated his sport. And there's no single player that will impact the sport as much as Federer when he retires. So you need to celebrate him now while he's still around, because when he's gone, the retrospective, I think, will be even stronger than it is now.